How much is it actually going to cost to do an LS swap on your car? So, LS swaps these days are incredibly popular, and for good reason. They're a relatively affordable way of making a lot of power. They're very simple, they're pretty reliable, parts everywhere. Now that's all good and everything, but how much is it actually going to cost? So for this particular example, I've got this E46. It's my first car, and it's a 320 Ci, so it's the coupe with the 2.2 litre straight six. It's not a bad car, but it's pretty slow. So I've been looking in how to make this car as fast as possible for the least amount of money. So let's just get into it. Things that you need to consider. Number one, you need to look at what your local government rules are on doing a conversion like this are. In the state that I live in, you need to do something called getting your car engineered or engineering, which is where you contact a engineer and they more or less look over your car after you've done the swap to make sure that it's safe. There's a lot more to it than that. They also look for things like upgrading the rest of the car so then the car can safely support the power. So upgrading the brakes, the driveline, suspension, cooling, that sort of thing. This isn't a big issue because if you build a well-sorted car, then you'll likely fix all of these issues, and getting your car engineered is not going to be a problem. However, in a lot of states like Queensland, from what I've been told, you can only fit an engine that's double the capacity of that car that it came out of. So a Nissan Silvia 200SX is a 2 litre SR20. You can't fit an engine that's bigger than 4 litres in swept capacity. With this particular car, this is a 2.2 litre, but this car also came out with the 330i, which is a 3 litre. So in theory, the biggest engine in terms of capacity that I can fit is a 6 litre. It's not only just capacity, it's also in regards to power to weight ratio. But a stock LS1, LS2 can be engineered for this particular car in New South Wales. The second thing that you need to think about is what engine, gearbox, wiring harness, ECU are you going to be using? So most people that LS swap this particular car go with either an LS1 or an LS2 with a T56 or a T660 with the stock GM ECU. You can't get a standalone ECU engineered due to the fact that they know that you're probably going to change it after. You're likely going to be changing the tune after you get the car engineered. Not that you can't do that on a stock ECU, you can still do it, but for some reason it's a no-go. It doesn't make much sense. So I found a LS2 L98 with a T56 with the GM wiring harness and ECU for $6,000. These were obviously used components, as if you were to buy these off the shelf, you're probably talking somewhere along the lines of 18 to 20,000 Australian dollars. So $6,000, that's great. The next thing I need to worry about is the rest of the driveline. So what a lot of engineers like to see is either the E46 M3 rear cradle axles and differential assembly, which bolts straight into this with a custom drive shaft. You could probably get away with using the medium case differential and just running a custom drive shaft. That would probably be strong enough as long as you're somewhat gentle in the driveline. But if you want to do it properly, you probably should get the E46 M3 rear cradle and bolt it in. There's a company called Brintech which modifies the standard subframe from the 6-cylinder BMWs, and they put in an R200 out of a Nissan Silvia. This is also a good option, but I would prefer to use the E46 M3 rear cradle because then stuff like traction control still works fine, but it's also another good option that's out there. The third thing is brakes. So using the stock 330 brakes would likely be enough, or you can use the E46 M3 brakes, which are only marginally bigger than the 330i. The really good thing about this is that it's a factory Australian design rule compliant part, so you can bolt it in and that part does not need to be engineered, compared to upgrading to like a Brembo 6-pot big brake kit. They're also really expensive. The same also applies with using the OEM E46 rear cradle. It does need to be engineered. Suspension is a bit of a funny one. I don't really know exactly what they're after. Potentially maybe a bigger sway bar and some upgraded front suspension to deal with the extra weight. The weight difference is minimal, but it's likely not a bad idea. To be honest, if you're going to spend 15 to 20 grand on an engine swap, you could probably put some nice Bilstein shocks with some nice springs on it. The rest is just the wiring. So you can run the LS off the LS wiring harness and ECU, and then you can use this thing called a CAN bus converter, which a lot of companies will sell you, which plugs into the E46 wiring harness and the LS wiring harness, and then it converts stuff like, it then converts the CAN bus signal so that your gauge cluster and the air conditioning still works and everything. These aren't that expensive, and they really are a must if you want to do a swap like this. So let's run some numbers. So the deal I found, the LS2 with the T56, the wiring harness, the ECU, $6,000. An E46M3 rear cradle assembly is about $5,000 to $6,000 as well. They're really expensive and they're hard to find. So we're currently at around $12,000. Custom tail shaft, around $1,500 to $2,000. Let's just say $2,000. $14,000. Miscellaneous fuel lines, fittings, hoses, clamps. This is probably safe to say it's going to be around $1,000. The fuel system itself, you can get away with running the stock fuel system with an upgraded fuel pump. Fuel pumps are pretty cheap, maybe a couple $100 for a Walbro 450. So about $300 for a Walbro 450, which is overkill. But so we're at $14,300 at the moment. Brakes. If you already have a 330, great, you can probably get away with using those brakes. Otherwise, a 330i brake upgrade is around $1,000, including the calipers, the discs, the pads. You'd probably want to throw in some braided brake lines just whilst you're at it. So $1,000 is a very reasonable target. We're now at $15,300. The cooling system, the stock E46 cooling system, if you have a 6-cylinder, is adequate for an LS swap, so you can leave that alone. You would need to run a GM power steering pump, but these are pretty cheap. So $200, a GM alternator, again a couple $100, $300. We're now at $15,800. The next thing is going to be the actual exhaust. The exhaust with all of the engine mounts and everything. This is a crucial step. We should have mentioned this earlier on. There's a kit that Brintec will sell you, which is around $4,500, and this comes with a lot of the components that you'll need to LS swap. So now we're at over $20,000 already. We're at $20,300. This comes with the headers, so you still need to make the rest of the exhaust. So you would need to fit some large catalytic converters, so I'd say minimum 2 300 cell cats, and then the rest of the exhaust. So this is going to cost probably another $1,500 to $2,000 for someone to fabricate up the exhaust. Let's say $2,000. We're at $22,300. You then need to get the car actually engineered, which is around $2,500 depending on the engineer and what things you need to get engineered. So assuming that it passes first go, you're now at just under $26,000. So for me to LS swap this car properly, we're talking around $26,000. See, it's not actually that cheap, is it? And this is using used components. The company that I'm talking about, Brintec, who actually make a lot of these parts, they also do in-house engine conversions, and they say that it costs around $50,000 for them to do like a drive-in, drive-out service. It's around $50,000, which is quite expensive, but if you think about how everything adds up, it makes perfect sense. So the total cost, again, $26,000, and that's you doing the work, by the way. Most of the work anyway. So you can see how a cheap LS swap on your road car can quickly be not very cheap at all. But at the same time, compared to a lot of other options, it is still quite affordable. And if anything goes wrong with your LS engine, there parts are everywhere. They're pretty cheap to repair. If you, like for example, if you blow up an S54 and you need to buy a new one. I actually got a quote a while ago, and I got a quote of $38,000. And that was just for a long engine, like a long block assembly, compared to a crate LS2's around $13,000, $14,000, which is still a lot of money, but it's a lot more affordable than an S54. So on paper, it's quite expensive, but if you calculate some of the other options that you have, it's still cheaper again. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This little documented list of the things that you need to do and how much it's actually going to cost to LS swap your car. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in a couple of days.